installment of the 2019 OTT School webinar series. My name is Joseph Ishaku, a research associate at the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa. CC is a think tank based in Abuja, Nigeria, and I'm also a fellow on the OTT TTI Fellowship Program, and I'm delighted to introduce Simon, who is a senior associate at Involve. He has a long and extensive experience in the fields of democratic reform, open government, public participation, stakeholder engagement, and transparency. He worked in international development and it's from this wealth of experience that he's sharing on the topic public engagement. So just to go over what this webinar is about, we'll be discussing the practical challenges of running public engagements in think tanks, and Simon will be also addressing questions such as who public is, how you can recruit them, what resources you need to organize the public, and the special skills that are required to run such public engagement events. He will draw on some examples from his experience, also what of his public work has had on public themselves and those with formal decision responsibility in both local and national government. So before we begin, I would like to go over some housekeeping notes. So here's how the webinar goes. Simon will shortly begin by sharing a presentation with us, which will last about 20 to 25 minutes, after which we would have a question and answer session. You can ask any questions you have via the chat box, and I'll pose these questions to Simon after his presentation. Do remember to keep your microphones muted during the webinar, and I think we can begin. Over to you, Simon.
Joseph, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. My microphone is now unmuted. I can see you nodding. Great. Thank you very much for a kind introduction, and to On Think Tanks and a joy for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here, and hope that I can give you some insights that are useful to your situation. So I'm going to be talking about public engagement and practical lessons. I've got a section, and it's probably the more substantial section of my presentation, that's entitled Theory, but the theory is intended to be as practical as possible, so that you can kind of hear where I'm coming from. The idea of basing it in theory is to really kind of give you a good understanding of kind of where I'm coming from. So what I'm hoping you're going to, assuming I can make my presentation work, which I don't appear to be able to, which is interesting. Why not? I'm doing something wrong with my screen sharing, I think. How's that? There we go. I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of the role that public engagement might play in helping you meet your objectives. And I'm working on the assumption that most of the people on the webinar are either think tanks or they're using research in order to influence policy. So that's the kind of the basis on which I've thought about how to present what I'm saying. But if I've got that wrong, then you can tell me in questions. And I'm going to do 3 brief things. And Joseph is going to wave at me after, give me 5 minutes warning by waving at me. Because there's a risk that I'll talk too long otherwise. So the 3 things I'm going to do are tell you very, very briefly who Involve is, just so you have an idea of where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, as I said, the theory, and help you think about kind of the some of the practicalities in relation to that theory, and then look at 4 or 5 different case studies from across the world that have used different forms of deliberative engagement. And we might talk in questions about what this thing deliberative engagement is. So Involve is a charity. We've been going for about 16 years or so, and our focus is really on trying to link the public and public voice into existing democratic institutions. So our focus is on Parliament and on government, and we work at local level, at national level, and indeed outside the nation state. But all the while our focus is very much on the UK and UK democracy, and so our interests are where decisions affect the UK, but I think that some of the lessons we might draw may be relevant for engagement in different contexts. So our mission is to develop and support and promote a democracy that works, and by that we mean gives people real power over the decisions that affect them, their communities and their nation. And we think that's built on 3 different elements. We think that requires openness. You need to know what decisions are being taken by who and when. Those decisions need to be taken involving the public. And if the public are going to be involved, there needs to be deliberation, because otherwise what you'll get is the loudest voices. And there are lots of different perspectives. There's a whole host of trade-offs between different interests in societies. And unless we hear all of those voices, and all of those voices are hearing each other and listening and learning and trying to identify a new consensus, then we're never going to give people real power to affect change. So, as I said, we work at lots of different levels. We work in the health service in the UK, both in England and Scotland at national level and local level. We've worked with our Cabinet Office on issues of open government and issues of data. We've worked with the OECD and with the World Bank and so on. So we work at lots of different levels, and we try to do 3 different things to implement our mission. The first is to advocate for more deliberative democracy. The second is to try to develop new coalitions to promote and call for and advocate for and work with us for more deliberative democracy. And the third is working directly with institutions to help them to develop engagement strategies and to actually go out and engage the public. So we work at senior level inside organisations to both help them think strategically about engagement as well as actually involving the public. And you'll hear about one of our projects as part of the case studies. But again, I can talk to you about any of our work if you're interested. So just a little bit of theory, although even though the picture suggests it, there are no equations in our work. So when you think, and when we talk to government officials, to politicians and to citizens about what public engagement is, we think about it as a process, and we think about it as a process that has 3 components. And the components are, first of all, thinking about why do you want to involve the public? What's the purpose? Why are you inviting the public into a particular piece of decision making or asking them to comment on and become involved in a bit of policy? What is it that the public can tell you that nobody else in the system, whether it's scientists, economists, politicians, stakeholders, why the public? Secondly, once you know why you're doing it, how are you going to do it? What's the best mechanism for involving the public in the sorts of questions that you've got for them? And finally, thinking about, well, once we know why we're doing it and what process, what sort of methodology we're going to use, well, how are we going to make sure that if we ask the public for their time, that we're going to be really sure that they're going to make a difference? So I'm going to take each of these in turn and think a little bit about them and talk to you a little bit about each 3 of these. So first of all, why engage? Well, many of you will have seen the involvement spectrum, the engagement spectrum that runs from the kind of lowest, often presented as the lowest form, informing the public, telling them what they're doing, consulting them, all the way through to empowering them. And I'm going to unpack this spectrum a little bit more, but it's often presented as a ladder. And if you're just informing people, you're not really engaging people. But if you're empowering them, then you're doing exactly what you should be doing. And one thing to note is that whenever you do this, you're always going to be involving more people further down the spectrum than higher up, just because of the time it takes, both for you, the time and money and resources it takes as you move higher up the spectrum, but also the amount of time you're asking for the public to get involved. So I want to kind of unpack that a little bit and think a little bit about decisions. So here's the same spectrum. And as I said, informing is often seen as being the lowest form of engagement. And we would argue that's not the case. It's very, very difficult for the public to get involved in all but the most simple of local level decisions, because there's all sorts of information they might need. It might be scientific, it might be economic, it might be social or cultural, but there's all sorts of things that the public, just like stakeholders, don't know, and they need information. So in order for the public to be engaged, they have to have a good basis of information. So when you're informing people, the public, you're going to be providing them with objective information. And some of your work will be providing people with objective information about the research that you've done. If you're consulting the public, then what you're doing is you're saying, we've got a pretty good idea of what the solution is, of what the research tells us, of what the policy solutions are, but we want to ask you some fairly narrow questions. They might be yes/no questions or relatively closed questions, because we're pretty confident we know what the answers are. We just want to check and test them with you. Once you're engaging with the public, you're beginning to think about how do you understand what their hopes and fears are, their aspirations and their concerns, and how are you going to reflect those in the research that you're doing and the policy proposals that you're developing. When you're moving to co-production, what you're really beginning to think about is, well, what are the sorts of problems that we should be working on? How do we actually work together with the public and with other stakeholders to define the questions we should be answering and the policies we should be working on, and then working all the way through to develop the alternatives and then prioritize what the right policy solutions are, all the way through to empowering the public, actually saying, we're going to help you make the decision and enact the decision. Now, none of these are the wrong thing to be doing, and it depends where you are in the system, what your ambitions are, what your objectives are, and we would argue that each of these are legitimate forms of engagement. But the critical thing is that when you tell the public that you are going to engage them, consult them, or do some co-production with them, the public will hear a promise, and the public will hear a promise that they're going to expect you to fulfill. So if you're thinking about doing any public engagement, you really do need to think about, what are the public going to hear when I tell them that I'm going to be doing this form of public engagement, and am I going to be able to deliver on the promise that the public are going to hear? So that's a really, really critical thing to be thinking about as you're beginning to think about, should I be involving the public? Just wanted to present one other form of thinking about this. So again, here's the spectrum, and you can see it with the arrows around the half circle. And the cycle in the middle just provides some different words of thinking about each of these different forms. So obviously when you're informing, you're doing one way, you're telling people. When you're consulting, you're asking the public. It's again one way, but it's one way towards you. As you move around or across the spectrum, you're ending up with discussion and debate, and there it's slightly more two-way, but when you think about debating, you're really trying to convince people. So I've got the right point of view, and I'm going to try and give you the facts and the figures so that you believe what I believe. When you're having a dialogue, well, you're trying to support two-way conversation, not just between you and the public, but between members of the public as well, and there's an element of trying to learn from it. And finally, when you're thinking about deliberation, you're really trying to understand each other's positions. You're trying to understand the evidence that you've got about the policy or the problem, and you're trying to reach some sort of new solution. So that might help you think again about kind of what form of engagement do I need to do. And obviously, most of what I'm suggesting here is really in relation to developing policy solutions, because that's the focus of the work of my organisation involved. But sometimes you might be doing engagement as a research technique, and each of the, at least the three types that are further around the spectrum are all valid techniques for carrying out research as well. So just thinking about that question of why. Why might you, as a research organisation, a researcher or a think tank, engage the public? I think that there are 4 possible reasons. One is because you want to collect evidence. You might need to collect evidence about how the public are living their lives, the problems they're facing, or you might want to be collecting evidence about the public's perspectives, their values, about what government or you or somebody else should be doing in the system. So you might be doing engagement to collect evidence. You might be doing engagement because you want to demonstrate that there's a really strong groundswell of opinion and the government should be doing something different. So you're trying to push the government into doing something different. You might be trying to empower the public. You might be trying to help the public to think about their situation in a different way, to give them evidence and information and arguments so they can actually take control of their own situation. Or you might be trying to get legitimacy for yourself and your research. You might be trying to demonstrate you've listened to a large number of people and that your research is therefore legitimate. Each of these objectives, the reasons for doing public engagement is important, but the types of your objectives will affect the types of engagement that you do and the numbers of members of public that you want to involve. Because clearly, if you're looking for legitimacy, well, you may well be trying to involve a much larger number of people than if you're trying to empower people. That may not be true, but what you're trying to do will affect how you do it, which takes us to the next element of our process, which is how are you going to do it? Now, there are a vast number of different ways you can engage the public, from one-way sort of methodologies such as focus groups, all the way through to those much more empowering and methodologies such as participatory budgeting, and all the way through to community development. Now, one of the things that we often find is that a senior member of government or politician will say, oh, I've heard about this thing called citizens' juries or panels or online engagement. We really must do some of that. And it's absolutely critical that you don't start with the methodology, but you start with why you're doing it, for the reasons that I suggested before. So always start with the why and then think about how you're going to do it, rather than thinking about, we really must do a World Cafe, an opinion poll, or whatever it is. So one way of thinking about which methodology are you should you be using is thinking about the policy cycle. Now, many of you will be well aware that the policy cycle is a fiction. It's an idealized view of how policy is made. We don't start from thinking about what we want to do and the political vision and move through policy formation. It's messy, it's iterative, it's very confusing. But still, as you think about the sorts of research you're doing and what you're trying to influence and the policies you're trying to develop, you'll have some idea about whether you're thinking about trying to develop new visions for what the world should look like, whether you're trying to develop policies which might help you reach a certain endpoint, or whether you're actually trying to decide between different policy proposals all the way through to actually implementing. But at each of these stages in the policy cycle, there are different forms of public engagement you might use. And this comes back to the why of the public engagement again, of course. So if what you're trying to do is to develop a political vision, you're going to want some form of open public engagement. You're going to want something that's quite deliberative. It may take a bit longer, but it's something that's going to engage your participants, members of the public, in creating new visions, new pictures. So it might be quite visual, it might be quite engaging, you might be creating physical maps. And many of these techniques you will recognize from a development context, but they're also used in the UK in different ways as well. And I think it's important to say that much of the work that we do in the UK has drawn on development theory, particularly from the 80s and 90s. So some of this you will recognise, and we're using some of these techniques, these methodologies in different formats that might be used in a development context. Once you get through to policy formation, what you're trying to do is say, this is we know where we want to be, we know what the world should look like, so what are the right policies? And here you're trying to develop policies. And again, these types of methodologies are perhaps slightly narrower, but again, they're still deliberative, because you're trying to work out what are the trade-offs between different types of policies. How do we understand these policies? And as you move around trying to make decisions, think about these policy proposals, the types of methodologies that you use will become more and more restrictive, will become narrower, much more into that kind of consultation type of engagement process where you're asking for yes, no answers. Should we do this or that? How much should we set the level of the tax at, for example? And then when you're at decision making, well, you're handing power over to a smaller group of people. And there you really will just be in informing mode. This is how the decision was made. This was who was made it and what decision was made. And then finally, you're back into delivery. And you may well be delivering, just it may be an institution that's delivering. And so you may just be still in one-way communication mode. This is what we're doing and how we're doing it. Or you may be working with the community to actually deliver the decision. And again, you may be in a very different part of the engagement spectrum, working with the community, doing co-production, or even kind of the community themselves delivering the policy. But again, really, really thinking about who's making the decision is absolutely critical for thinking about what kind of engagement you should be doing.